Hi, everybody. Ian Bremmer here, and a quick take for today on USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development, which is in the process of being shut down. Nearly all Washington staff have been put on leave. They're closing missions abroad. The State Department moving to evacuate all staff around the world. Why should we care? Does this matter? This agency was set up back over 50 years ago, 1961, by then President John F. Kennedy, and it was meant to coordinate the distribution of foreign aid for the United States all over the world and differentiate that from military support that was provided by the United States. And Secretary of State Marco Rubio has said that the U.S. isn't providing charity. That's not what foreign aid is, that it should be providing support for U.S. national interests. And I agree that it should be providing support for U.S. national interests, but it is important to recognize that actually when USAID was set up, it was set up in part as charity, that President Kennedy's position was that the United States had a moral obligation to support poorer people and poorer countries around the world. They are fellow human beings, after all, and the United States has historically benefited massively from developing resources all around the world, and frequently the people that lived in those countries didn't get very much as a consequence. And the U.S. has benefited massively, as have other wealthy countries, from industrialization and putting carbon into the atmosphere that now poor countries can't do because of climate change. And we're saying we need to transition, but the U.S. of course has gotten the benefits of that historically. My view is I'm okay with charity. I actually think that helping save lives with food and medicine for millions of people, and especially babies and children, I mean, even if it did nothing for the United States directly, I would be okay with spending some of the money of American taxpayers on that, especially as opposed to, say, a war in Afghanistan or the latest, sort of bomber program that is expensive and more than the Americans need. So I push back on the U.S. should never do charity argument. But leaving that aside, you don't need that argument to focus on the importance of USAID. And I want to, before I get into the national interest side, I do want to say I am empathetic with why it is unpopular, because at a moment when so many average Americans feel like the U.S. government has not taken care of them, and this is why you see so much backlash against all of the illegal immigrants that have not been addressed by administrations for many years, and why there's so much backlash against the U.S. establishment, whether it's Democrat or Republican, in saying, what about the average working American? What about our healthcare? What about our public school system? What about things that you should care a lot more about than sending aid to brown people around the world, which is essentially what USAID is mostly doing. I get that, and in that regard, it's an easy target for Trump. It's a particularly easy target for Elon Musk. I would ask first, why tax cuts for and regulations written by billionaires in the United States before poor people and Americans. That would be my higher priority if I was really, really angry and antagonized by how badly money is being spent in the U.S. But that's a different story. The point is, you don't need to make the argument of charity. It is very clear that U.S. foreign aid supports America's economic and national security interests. It is growing markets for consumers, for American businesses and products all over the world. The U.S. has the biggest businesses, it has the biggest market, it benefits the most from other countries around the world having more capacity to sustainably consume and engage with those businesses. America benefits in having more health security by containing disease and pandemics, because those diseases and pandemics don't suddenly stop at the American border. The U.S. benefits from aid that reduces insurgencies, creating instability that leads to more illegal migration all over the world, many of whom ultimately end up in the United States. It creates more economic opportunity and safety and security in origin countries, and that is a carrot that matters. It's not just about sticks. It's a carrot for economic statecraft that gives the Americans more influence as opposed to, say, the Russians or, more importantly, the Chinese. Because getting rid of USAID and cutting back on all these programs creates a vacuum. And that is an opportunity for adversaries. I've already seen ministers from large African countries who have their American programs getting cut off, reaching out immediately to their counterparts, ministers in China, saying, are you willing to send in the programs to replace the Americans that are leaving? And China doesn't have the economic wherewithal the Americans do, but they certainly will seize opportunities that are economically useful to them long term because they have a much longer term perspective on these things than a U.S. administration that's gone in 4 years. So I worry about that. I think that USAID has been America's principal interlocutor with civil society in developing countries. And to the extent that we care about those countries having systems that are more aligned with the values and standards that the United States has historically promoted, then you don't want to undermine that and allow the Chinese to come in, which has very little interest in civil society, indifferent to civil society. It's a source of intelligence for the United States, and we've seen that even if it's sometimes uncomfortable for the local governments who aren't necessarily in favor of that. It is, true that all USAID projects are probably not going to ultimately be killed, that the State Department is going to take it over. And Marco Rubio has said that, there's a lot of corruption in USAID and a lot of this money is misspent and is spent badly and breaks executive orders. And I am sure that is true. And I am sure that that corruption needs to be addressed. It wouldn't surprise me. The U.S. is an incredibly bloated government system. But shooting first and asking questions later tends to kill innocence. And that is, of course, the approach here. And the reality is that Elon and Trump and their ability to act and be destructive is much greater than the damage control that the Secretary of State can do at this moment. And the State Department just does not have the people or the infrastructure to execute on a lot of these programs once USAID is shut down. And the message that this is really sending to allies is that the United States is an unreliable partner. You cannot count on it, that what they say to you in one administration is not going to be consistent in a second administration in a way that is not true with other countries, most other countries around the world. And so I continue to believe, as I did before Trump was inaugurated, that the U.S. is going to see a lot of wins. A lot of countries are going to bend to his will because he is more powerful and he is willing to use that power directly. But that does not mean that the United States will long-term succeed in a law of the jungle approach, an approach which is all stick and no carrot, even when the stick is very, very big, but you can't wield it effectively for a long period of time. And other countries are learning that carrots are kind of smart. I mean, the Chinese originally perfected the all stick and no carrot approach and then saw that the United States was more effective in a lot of countries because they also had economic statecraft. They also had these commercial levers. And so the Chinese started saying, oh, we need to figure out how to deliver aid to a lot of these countries. Doesn't have to be transparent, can work right with the governments, but ultimately that's going to give us more influence in these countries. And that is something that President Trump and his administration, in the early weeks at least, seem to be jettisoning. So I think this is penny wise, pound foolish. I think it is short-term beneficial to Trump and will look like a win for him and his base, and long-term will undermine U.S. power around the world and will, of course, make the world a less stable place. So on balance, I think this is a problem. It's not something that I think is going to go well. I would love to be proven wrong. I'll be watching it carefully, and I think it's a good thing to be debating. So that's it for me, and I'll talk to y'all real soon.